If you and I are to believe the truth and live the truth in a world that denies and often disdains the truth, we need to focus relentlessly on gospel essentials. And we need to do all that is within our power to avoid foolish controversy.
Welcome to Encounter the Truth with Jonathan Griffiths. I'm Steve Hiller, and Jonathan, I'm so glad that you point out the fact that as believers, we are to engage with the culture differently, that we do end up in conversation very often with people who hold differing viewpoints from us. And it could be political, could be even theological differences from time to time with those that we engage with. And you're calling us to avoid foolish controversy. Why is it so important, do you think, for us to avoid getting into some of those conversations unnecessarily?
Well, the Apostle Paul here in the passage we're going to be looking at in Titus just says that foolish controversies are worthless. And he points out the fact that there will be those people who like to stir up division. And we see that from time to time, even within Christian community. And we need to just be very, very careful about engaging in controversies that are not profitable. I mean, it's very easy to get into a sort of verbal fist fight over issues, and we've all got things we're passionate about, and we know there are differences of opinion and so on. But there are some conversations that, maybe aren't worth having. It's just not a fruitful conversation. And learning which those things are that are fruitful to engage over and to discuss, and which are the best things just to leave aside, that takes discernment and maturity, to be sure. But if we focus on the things as Christians that the Bible focuses on and majors on, I think we're in a position of safety. And the Bible focuses on Jesus and the gospel and on godly living. There are big themes in the Bible that give us plenty to talk about and plenty to think about.
Well, let's look at God's Word together then. We're in Titus chapter 3 as we look at verses 8 to 15 and continue this message called Devoted to Good Works. Here is Jonathan.
In our natural state, the Bible tells us we are not capable of doing good. Of course, God in His grace, He limits the evil of society and He enables some measure of good deeds even by those who do not know Him. That's what theologians call common grace, and it's a wonderful thing. But to truly do the good that God calls us to do as His people, it takes His intervention, it takes His saving grace, it takes His empowerment by His Spirit. It is a supernatural work. Or to put it all another way, it takes the gospel. It takes the gospel. Now, if we are concerned about good works, concerned about creating a countercultural community that will live differently and impact society in a beautiful and a grace-filled way, if we care about that, as I hope we do, I really hope we care about that, what is the strategy that we should then follow as a church? Major on social action, on justice issues, on good deeds is our main emphasis? No, not in the first instance, surprising as that may seem. Preaching good works is a dead-end street because the human heart is not actually capable of good works on its own in sin. No, the way to get transformed lives, the way to get to good works, to godly living, it is by insisting on gospel basics. It is by the proclamation of the truth. The saying is trustworthy. And I want you to insist on these things so that those who have believed in God may be careful to devote themselves to good works. We have some folk in the church who have been very concerned about the availability of clean and safe water in some communities in Africa where they have a particular connection. Many in the church family will know about this very good initiative. Now, if a community is in need of good drinking water, there are essentially two ways, I think, to attempt to address the problem. One is to supply by delivery quantities of bottled water. And you drop off big pallet loads of plastic water bottles at intervals and hope that one delivery tides the community over to the next. It's something. But it obviously doesn't solve the problem in a sustainable way. And if deliveries get disrupted, the plan, it breaks down. The other approach is to go in and dig a well, as our friends do. Get the heavy equipment in there. Address the root issue. Secure a life-giving supply, and the community is now equipped to flourish and to live and to grow. When it comes to transformed lives, to godly living, to doing good works, God's strategy in a dry and barren land on the landscape of this world, God's strategy is to address the fundamental issue of the heart. His strategy is the gospel. That's where the well of living water is to be found. It's not a patchwork or a piecemeal solution. It transforms us from within, and it gives us the resources to begin to live in a new kind of way. Notice the language that Paul uses here in his gospel summary in verse 5. He speaks of the washing of regeneration and renewal of the Holy Spirit. That's where change comes from. That's how life transformation comes about. This is the life-giving well. It is the gospel. I think we can sometimes imagine in a caricatured kind of a way that there are two types of churches out there, perhaps two types of Christian. On the one hand, there are the gospel people, who just drive home the message of salvation and the hope of heaven all the time. Then there are the more practical folk who name the name of Christ, who maybe don't talk so much about judgment and salvation and so on, but they really focus on social action, good works, that sort of thing. But genuine Christianity does not allow for an either or. In biblical apostolic Christianity, the gospel drives transformation. The gospel leads to good works. But the emphasis, the obsession, the insistence, the drumbeat and the dominant theme is this: it is the trustworthy message of the gospel. Paul was certainly concerned that the Christians at Crete should stand out for their lifestyle and their good works. This was an ugly society. We've seen that again and again in the series, chapter 1 and verse 12, yet again. Cretans are always liars, says Paul, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. Christians, they got to live differently in that place. And only the gospel is going to empower that transformed lifestyle. And so, friends, I think there are two takeaways here at this point in the passage. One is this: if you want to live a transformed life, if you want to do good and you want to impact the world by a profitable and godly life, the place to start, here it is the gospel. That's where your heart is going to be transformed and you will be renewed and empowered to live a different kind of life. And so let me ask you, if you long to live a useful life and to do good in this world, have you received all that Jesus offers you in the gospel? Have you come to him in your sin and your need? And have you confessed that before him and asked him to forgive you and cleanse you and make you new and fill you by the Spirit? Have you asked him? Because that's where all this begins. And if you haven't, let me say today is the day, and now is the time. For us as believers, for us as a church, we need to be so careful. We need to be so insistent to keep the gospel at the very center, to keep the main thing the main thing. If you lead a small group, if you teach a Sunday school class, if you disciple children at home, let me encourage you, insist on the essentials of the gospel all the time. Never move on from it. Never sideline it. This is our drumbeat. This is our life-giving message. This is our heart-captivating obsession. Church must insist on gospel essentials so that we will be devoted to good works. That's the positive admonition. But there is a negative side to all this too. And Paul emphasizes this next. The church must avoid foolish controversy, he warns us. This is verse 9. Notice it with me. But avoid foolish controversies, genealogies, dissensions, and quarrels about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless. The gospel is going to lead to good works, which Paul tells us in verse 8 are excellent and profitable for people. There is another kind of teaching, there is another kind of discussion, another type of obsession that will go in precisely the opposite direction, that will be unprofitable and worthless. And Paul is very clear, we need to be at pains to avoid it. We know from earlier in the letter that there was the potential for this kind of thing in the church at Crete. False teachers were trying to infiltrate the fellowship and were causing trouble. Chapter 1 and verse 10, for there are many who are insubordinate, empty talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision party. They must be silenced since they are upsetting whole families. The believers themselves, they need to be warned, chapter 1 and verse 14, so that they may not devote themselves to Jewish myths and the commands of people who turn away from the truth. There's plenty to distract the Cretan believers from the trustworthy essentials of the gospel, plenty that might cause controversy within the fellowship. And Paul tells Titus as a church leader, avoid foolish controversies. Yes, there are some wrong ideas floating around, some bad teaching. It seems that in this context, some of it related to the Old Testament law and the interplay between Christianity and Judaism in those early days of the church. You can see why that's a big issue. The circumcision party, who Paul refers to in chapter 1, presumably they were insisting that followers of Jesus needed to be circumcised to be in good standing before God. It looks as though the genealogies of the Old Testament were providing some fascination and intrigue for some. There was plenty to argue about in terms of Old Testament law and how to apply it to Christians. And presumably there was some real pressure in Crete for Titus now to get into the ring and enter some of these discussions. Come on, Titus, what do you think? But Paul's admonition here, I think it is very, very interesting, and it's probably counterintuitive. It's very instructive, very important for us. He says to Titus, avoid it altogether. Don't even begin the conversation. It's going nowhere good. Don't even have it. I think one of the greatest challenges for church leaders, for pastors and elders, is actually to discern which conversations to have, which issues to address. At any given moment, there will be a number of issues of interest to folk that we could open up for discussion or debate. We'll occasionally have folk actually from within the church or from outside the church come to us and say, or write an email and say, would you consider addressing this particular issue publicly? Would you take a position? Would you issue a statement on such and such? Now, we might tend to think that in a spirit of open dialogue and intellectual curiosity, we ought to open up every issue we possibly can. Rip open every can of worms, put everything on the table all the time. That might seem like the right thing to do. I think that's certainly the spirit of our age at the present time. But Paul wants Titus to know, and what he wants us to see is that we need to choose and discern when to engage and when to stand back. And that's not always easy. A good batsman in a sport like baseball or cricket needs to learn the essential skill of when to swing at a ball and when just to let it pass. And that is true for churches and church leaders too. And there will be plenty of issues, plenty of discussions, plenty of debates where the very best thing we can do as a church leadership and as a whole body of believers, the best thing we can actually do in the end is to refrain from doing anything. And the best thing we can say is actually nothing at all. In fact, on certain issues and in certain debates, we need to be very careful to do all that we can to avoid entering into it at all. We need to actively avoid, says Paul, foolish controversies, dissensions, theological quarrels, and so on. In a sense, I tend to think that this discipline of avoiding foolish controversies has become more difficult and more complicated of late. There are, of course, always foolish controversies to be found in the wider world and in the wider church. But in the pre-social media age, we didn't know about quite so many of them all at once. But the great challenge we now face is that we catch wind of debates and arguments taking place in other parts of our own country and other parts of the world, in other sections of the church. And that increases both the pressure and, I think, the temptation just to dive on in. Added to that, the social media world makes it far too easy for us as a whole church, or for us as individual Christians or as leaders, to wade in with our own thoughts and opinions very, very quickly. I actually see this happening all the time, particularly among Christian leaders. A debate is heating up on social media, and folk just can't resist wading in. And it's clearly folly. No good is going to come of this. And as a church, as pastors and elders, and as Christian believers individually, each one of us, we need to take seriously the admonition. Don't get drawn in to unfruitful and harmful discussions, debates, and controversies. Just don't do it.
You're listening to Encounter the Truth with Jonathan Griffiths and a message called Devoted to Good Works. It's the last message in our series, Transformed by Truth, where we've been looking at the book of Titus. And if you've missed any of the broadcasts in this series, you can always come to our website and you can listen online. Our website address is encounterthetruth.org. That's encounterthetruth.org. Well, when you're at the website, I hope you'll consider giving a gift of support, because we're able to bring you Jonathan's teaching because of your generosity. We stay on this station with your financial help. But as you give a gift of any amount this month, we want to say thank you by sending you a classic book written by Elizabeth Elliot. It's called Through Gates of Splendor. Simply our way of saying thanks. You can find out more or give online when you come to encounterthetruth.org. All right, let's get back to the message. Once again, here is Jonathan.
Now, at this point, we have to ask the question, what counts as a foolish controversy and a discord that we ought to avoid? And what counts as an issue or a debate that we ought to entertain? That's a big question, isn't it? And there's no simple or straightforward answer. It's going to take some wisdom and some prayerful discernment. But, we might be inclined to say something like this. If the issue has to do with the Bible, then we'll open it up. But if it doesn't, then we won't. That might sound like a wise approach. But just notice that the kinds of issues that Paul evidently had in mind in his day, they did indeed touch upon the Bible. They included, verse 9, speculations about genealogies, which probably refers to debates around the significance of genealogies in the Old Testament. They included quarrels about the law, that is the Old Testament law. So on the surface, these discussions, at least some of them at any rate, were about the meaning of the Bible text. And Paul nonetheless says, avoid it. And to be fair, most of the unprofitable debates and discussions I have seen take place in churches do tend to circle around the meaning of the Bible on a particular issue. Generally, the debate doesn't just ignore the Bible altogether. So it probably won't do to say that everything that touches on Scripture is worth discussing and debating in every setting. No, it probably won't be as simple as that. Where Paul takes us here for discernment is actually to the expected outcome of the discussion. Notice that with me. He points out the kinds of discussion in the debate we should avoid is, end of verse 9, unprofitable and worthless. This contrasts very starkly with the good works that flow from insisting on gospel essentials, end of verse 8, which are excellent and profitable for people. Now, I think that's actually very, very helpful. It's not a detailed step-by-step answer to our question, of course, but it gives us the guidance that we need. Majoring on the gospel, that will lead to transformed lives and good works that are excellent and profitable. Majoring on foolish debates, theological disputes, silly controversies, these aren't going to produce godliness. They won't produce good works. They won't be profitable. And so when we wonder whether to wade into something, whether to open up a discussion or a debate, we have to ask the question, is this at the end of the day going to help our godliness? Will it ground us better in the gospel? Will it fire our hope for eternal life so that we'll be better equipped to live out that gospel through fruitful good works? Is it going to do that for us? And if the answer is no, as so often the answer is no, we ought to be very careful to drop the issue, to graciously back out of the discussion and just move on with good gospel work. Saying all that, the awkward reality is that from time to time, folk will come along who will be insistent on drawing others into unprofitable dissensions and debates. That's what Paul indicates and really warns us of in verse 10. There will be some in the life of the church from time to time who just seem insistent on stirring up division. Now, mercifully, in my own experience, such people only come along from time to time. But they do come along, and Paul has a very clear instruction for us, but one I think that could be a little bit surprising. Again, I think his logic here is a little surprising. We need to hear it. Notice it with me here in verse 10. As for a person who stirs up division, after warning him once and then twice, have nothing more to do with him. Knowing that such a person is warped and sinful, he is self-condemned. Now, within the church, we are always looking for reconciliation and peace. Of course we are. Whenever there is a relational challenge of one kind or another, that's what we will desire, and we must desire that. And we might think, we probably would assume that it is our responsibility to doggedly press on with conversation and engagement until we get peace on all fronts and everyone reconciled and settled, everyone content. We might assume that that is the only acceptable godly outcome. Anything less is a complete failure. But verse 10 teaches us an important principle, one we really need to know, remember, and hold to. When a person is bent on stirring up division in the church, after appropriate warnings, it is time for the church just to draw a line under the situation, to bring the conversations to a conclusion and actually have nothing more to do with that person. It might sound rather harsh. I think it perhaps does to our ears. But for the health and harmony of the church, Paul insists this is necessary. You must do this. If the church is going to focus on gospel essentials and there is someone on the sidelines just pushing for a fight on some issue or other, the only way forward is to make it clear to that person that they're not welcome to continue causing disruption and division. That is a hard thing to do. But for the sake of the church, it's sometimes necessary. At the very close of Titus, Paul once again underlines his central theme, the theme that's driven this whole letter. Having sent his various greetings, he comes back to the outcome of our faith in godly living. And notice it with me in verse 14 as we close. He says, "And let our people learn to devote themselves to good works so as to help cases of urgent need and not be unfruitful." Within the life of the church, within the Christian life, there is this unbreakable connection between sound doctrine and sound living, between gospel truth and godliness of life. If you and I are to believe the truth and live the truth in a world that denies and often disdains the truth, we need to focus relentlessly on gospel essentials. And we need to do all that is within our power to avoid foolish controversy. For the sake of our own spiritual health, for the sake of our witness in the world, for the sake of the glory of God, may He give us the grace for this, for the days that are to come.
Jonathan Griffiths here on Encounter the Truth, a message called Devoted to Good Works. And a great reminder today that believing the gospel will result in us doing good works. It's not the works that save us, but they're just a natural fruit, a natural result of our salvation. So we ought to be seeing good works if we really have understood the gospel and been transformed by truth. And that's what our series is all about, that transformation of truth that we've been looking at in the book of Titus. If you missed any of the broadcasts in the series, come and listen online. You can listen at encounterthetruth.org. That's also the place to go if you'd like to give a gift to support, because we do depend on your generosity to keep Jonathan's teaching on this station. And as you give a gift of any amount, we want to say thank you by sending you a book called Through Gates of Splendor. You can find out more or give online at encounterthetruth.org. That's encounterthetruth.org. Or you can call us at 1-833-99-TRUTH. That's 1-833-998-7884. Well, thanks for listening today. For Jonathan and for our producer, Mark Bretta, I'm Steve Hiller, and I hope you'll join us next time.